Welcome back to another Senate prediction for the 2024 election coming up this May 5th of 2024. So for starters, we have an election map that's already filled in with the prerequisite safe states. These are the ones that I'm willing to bet my children that don't exist yet over, basically. So when we're looking at it, there's 47 Senate seats available for the Republicans, already pretty much eschewed right there. 39 for the Democrats, so it's an uphill battle to say the least. Last time we saw this electoral map, which switches every 6 years, basically we had this in 2018, and the Republicans gained seats in a blue wave midterm. And so when we're looking at it that way, we're also looking at an election where Trump is leading the popular vote by 2%, which is unprecedented, which is crazy. So we can have an unprecedented third Trump term, kind of, where we have a guy who's coming in with a polling advantage. And that's after, again, 3 cycles where he's been on the ballot. Anyway, moving on to the state of Texas, I think is going to be the closest of the ones next. So this state is probably the one with the most amount of people and the most contentious out of the two large states, that being Florida and Texas. I think that Texas, looking at the polls, look really favorable for a guy like Ted Cruz. You look at these polls, they haven't even been conducted in about a month, which shows that people aren't investing money in it. And think of all the great colleges in Texas, and yet they're not spending their resources on polling this because they know that Cruz is going to win. This is with the last election in 2018 being a big win for Ted, in a narrow victory, but a large one. And what I mean is that the stakes of the state are huge, but overall, an unpopular candidate like Cruz should be carried into a victory by Donald Trump. So I will fill this in red, as Trump is leading the polls by about 10 at this point. So that's pretty obvious. So obviously, moving on to New Mexico, it's not looking very hopeful, as there's basically no polling for the Senate election. And whether that means that it's unelectable for a Republican to get in there, it's mostly true that even though you have a person who's a descendant of a popular politician in Senate history from the Southwest, it doesn't mean that the Republican really has much of a shot. And what I mean is that obviously there'd be polling. Okay. So if there isn't polling at all for the state, then it means that people that are invested in the state aren't really viewing it as a contested one. And so I'm viewing it as a blue one easily. And that's just that much obvious. The more obvious when I point it out to you. Now, moving on, I think Florida is also another case of that where, again, the polling hasn't been very recent, and the reason being that we have Scott up, as the most recent polls from 3 weeks ago show, up by 17, 16, etc. And again, when you look at the name of the person running against him, presumably it's Muscarel or Mescasrol Powell. Okay, nobody knows who that is. Again, somebody like me who's read into this stuff doesn't even know who that is profoundly, which is to say that, of course, it is not being contested like it was the last election. And so that is to say that they have given up on funding that. And so I think that's a safe Republican seat if you look at it that way. So it's now 49-40. It's getting really narrow, this odds of Democrats winning the race, but it gets better for them. Okay. So when we look at Minnesota, that's a safe blue seat. The reason being is that Minnesota, for whatever reason, votes to the left of the country more or less ever since 8 years ago. And what's also interesting about the state is that even after the George Floyd riots and a lot of reason for them to switch parties, they still voted for Biden more than they did for Hillary in 16 and contrasted to 20. And so that is to say that the thing is looking horrible. Now, you look at the primary candidate on the ballot, that's going to be Amy Klobuchar. Okay, so Biden's leading the state in the polls more or less. Okay, so if you look at this, you see that Biden's leading all these old polls by a decent amount, and so that's pretty evident. Now, you look at the Senate election, and it gets even worse, where you have Frazier, who nobody knows who that is losing to Klobuchar in these polls as of a long time ago by 17 or 16 points. And so it's very obvious to me that somebody who's done so well electorally will continue to do so. You look at 2006, she beats the Republican Mark Kennedy by 21%. You look at 2012, that next election, she wins the race by 35%. You look at 2018, the last one, and she won that one by 24. And so she's outperforming Biden, she's outperforming Hillary, she's outperforming Obama and everybody in between. And so that means it's going blue. And if it doesn't, then you can kill me. But it's not going to happen. Now, moving on, I think West Virginia is another state that's not really contested. This gives you a Senate majority if you do win the presidency under Trump, because obviously Manchin was a conservative Democrat, whatever that means. And so it's evident that if he steps out, it's probably not because he's a great guy and wow, he's in his 70s, he wants to give up power. It's more so that he knew he was going to lose and he wanted to keep his dignity. And so that's really the case. Now, that's going red. And when you look at the next state over, Virginia's not really contested. And what I mean is that, of course, there's been some recent promise with the Youngkin Republican surge. That in and of itself, though, is somewhat of a fluke. And so to be honest, when you look at these polls, there hasn't been any any done and paid for with any candidate that you could discern to be on the ballot in November. Instead, they're using a hypothetical between Tim Kaine, who's a Washington, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton acolyte, and that sort of establishment Democrat does really well in Nova and these populated regions in Virginia. And when you put him against a Youngkin, who's a popular Republican opponent theoretically, and mind you, who's not running for this race, he's still losing by 5 in the most recent poll, which is to say, of course, that it's going blue. And it might be closer than it was the last election, but that really doesn't matter, okay? So close only counts in hand grenades and what? Horseshoes? Anyway, again, with Maine, it's not really contested at this point. When you really look at it, a person like Angus King is somebody who's popular with that sort of you would say it's a majority state of white, country club Republicans and liberal Democrats. And so you put somebody who caucuses with the Democrats but is ostensibly an independent on the ballot, that's going to do really well. And so Angus King will easily win Maine. If you see here, Angus King won the last election in 2018 by an order of magnitude of about 20%. That is at the face of Eric Brakey, who nobody knows the existence of who that is, but evidently he got 35% of the vote, and the Democrat, Zach Rigglestein, got 10.5%. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is that you take the two partisan sides, and they're still smaller than the centrist. So that kind of shows the inclination of the state. It shows what direction it's going at. It shows you why somebody like Angus King, who's a center-left Democrat, so to speak, basically won a lot and will win by a lot this time, versus, again, Suzanne Collins, again, somebody who's a liberal Republican, and she does well electorally. So it gives you a vibe check as to what the people like in that state. So that's going to be more or less a Democrat seat, even though technically the color doesn't go that way, but we're going to put it as such. So now it's 43-50. There's a Hail Mary chance that the Democrats sweep the rest and get in there. But just like LeBron against the Nuggets, I doubt that's going to work out for them. But we'll see right now. So Montana is a state that a lot of liberal YouTubers will put as Democrat. This does not really contort or comport with reality, okay? When you look at the polls, we have some very lowly populated polls, but I mean, it is a small state, relatively speaking. You look at John Tester, who is missing fingers. Have you guys known that? But anyway, John Tester is losing to Sheehy by about 3%. Now, this is at the face of Trump winning the state in the surveys by about 15%, 20%, 21%, 22%, 20%, 21%. And so unless the Republican that's under the same ticket as Trump gets less than 20% more than Donald, then there's no way they lose. And so, I mean, just looking at that, it's very obvious what happens here. Here's my proof, okay? Team Sheehy is a different guy than Matt Rosendale. Matt Rosendale lost to John Tester after not getting enough funding. Now, he lost this in a swing state, or sorry, not a swing state, but in a blue wave, in a red state, with Trump not on the ballot, to John Tester, who only got 50% of the vote. So that's a 4-point win. And when you look at it one way, John Tester won on the back of Donald Trump, who was controversial. That is not as much of a big deal now because his popularity is contrasted to Biden's. And so that offsets. Now, in relation to 2018, one thing that was really big on the ballot was healthcare. Healthcare was something that was killing Republicans at the time. That is not so much an issue anymore when Donald Trump is over here promising some half-assed like Obamacare but better. And so when you're looking at that, healthcare isn't really that big of a deal. If you could say abortion is a healthcare issue, perhaps, but even then, the people of Montana are probably not that liberally disposed towards abortion as compared to some place like Arizona. Therefore, I think that won't be a killer issue for Sheehy. And so with that being said, I think it's an easy win for the Republican Party in the state of Montana. So now they have a majority outright. It doesn't matter if the vice president is Democrat or a turncoat Republican. That's a Trump majority if you see one. Now, let's see if we can pad this result. 51-43, there's 6 left. Ohio is a state that Trump's winning by about 10, which is in concordance with 2016 and 2020. So he's going to do a little bit better than those last 2 elections where he already killed it in the state. And so you have to imagine that anybody who loses to Brown is basically going to be a person that underperforms the guy on the top of the ticket by over 10%. That hardly if ever happens in today's polarized economy, but let's see. So as you guys can tell, the polling hasn't been really updated since the primary. The primary basically was a complete freak show to watch. And so you can't really surmise it out of this. So we're going to have to take some intelligence elsewhere. So again, polling has been really behind because low-key people know that the Republicans are going to win the state of Ohio at the federal level and as well as the Senate in particular, because when you look at it, Democrats love to have polls where they're up, like in case of Gallego in Arizona and in other cases like in Wisconsin. Now we're looking at a state of Ohio where Trump's up by 10. And if you look at the polling, there hasn't been a concise poll in about 2 months, okay? So when you look at the polls of Moreno versus Brown, this is from March before he won the primary. That has a lot to do towards the negative for the Republicans because that's before they were consolidated between one candidate. And you can look at the evidence, which is that Brown is at 45% where he's winning here, 43, 39, 42. So in the polls where he's winning, he has less than 45% of the vote. In a 1v1 race, to have less than 45 is asinine. What that means is that there's a ton of unsure people, most of those being Republicans, evidenced by the sense that they probably were going to vote for somebody other than Moreno in the primary. But given the approval of Trump, who endorsed Moreno in that primary, who won him the primary decisively, we know that over 90% of those people will come back home to the MAGA plantation. What that means for you is that Republicans are going to coalesce behind whoever's being endorsed by Trump on the Senate, which is to say that if he wins it by 10, that Moreno can probably win by 5 or 6. When we look at Sherrod Brown as a person, he's to the left of Biden on virtually everything, whether that be tariffs on the economy, whether that be on healthcare, but in more importance, he is super pro-Palestine in that nonsense, and that's going to kill him politically. Now, predicted, I think, has Brown winning slightly in the odds. So if you want to double your money, go ahead and invest in Ohio's Senate race. I would if I had more money. So like if I had a retirement fund, I would literally pull the $500,000 out of my dad's account and just put that into Ohio. I'm lowballing him, but yeah, no, totally. If you are in your 50s, you want to take it out real quick, 20% penalty, make double. I'm just saying, theoretically, there's a lot of free money out there when you're really woke on these issues. Now, I think another important state is going to have to be the one right above it, okay? Michigan is important. Michigan is an open seat, as we all know, one of 2 major open seats. It's going to have Alyssa Slotkin, who is a known establishmentarian Jewish Democrat. I point that out because she has been criticized by the pro-Arab, the Palestine, Gazan sympathetic crowd as being too pro-Israel. Now, that is going to bite her in the primary, not even so much the primary election, but I'm saying more so the fact that the people in the primary, the core of the base, are not going to be as enthusiastic to come out to vote when you have somebody who's so pro-Israel as Alyssa Slotkin, who's Jewish, okay? So you have somebody in Rogers who's an establishment Republican endorsed by Trump. I think he would do pretty well in the Oakland area, these places that are relatively, I would say, establishment Bush Republican, okay? So when you look at it that way, he has the Trump endorsement and he has the bona fides of being elected before by the establishment wing of the Republican Party. This is at the foot of a very contentious race for the chairmanship of the Republican GOP in, of course, Michigan. And so with that being said, it looks like Trump is going to lead whoever wins the state by about 1 or 2%, okay? So what I mean there is that Trump is probably going to win by like 2 or 3, and I think that Rogers is going to lose very little and still win. And so when you look at it that way, it's like the luxury store edition of the Republican thing in Lake and Trump, okay? So when you look at it that way, you have a Republican win very slightly, but there you go. That's at the back of, obviously, Joe Biden sucking, Trump doing well in Michigan, and on top of that, Rogers being non-controversial. Beyond that, of course, we have somebody in Slotkin who brings nothing new to the table. And in fact, her ethnicity might actually piss off the right amount of people in Dearborn, in these places where there's a ton of people that are just now voting in this election over the Palestine issue. Now, moving on, I think Pennsylvania is a state that's going Democrat. A lot of reasons are for that, but I think one of them is really important. So when we look at the facts, of course, Casey is winning all these polls. Going back as about recently as last week, he's up by 4. Now, what's important about this is that Trump is winning Pennsylvania by like a couple percent. And so if you have Trump winning Pennsylvania by like 3 and Casey up by 4, then that's a 7-point discrepancy. So what that means is that Casey is really popular for whatever reason. And then what he has that he usually did before, which is that, okay, Obama's a decent president, whatever, is that the abortion thing, he could beat that over the head of the Republican opponent. And McCormick, is the guy who's his opposition, isn't really popular at all. And so when you're looking at it, he's this businessman, carpetbagger. I mean, he has a lot of like the nominal traits of Trump without the swag. And so when you're looking at it that way, you lack charisma in a race where you're already down by 4. I don't think he's going to win it. So money aside, I don't think Democrats can lose this. But moving on, I think Wisconsin is another important one. I think Eric Hovde is running a fantastic campaign. He's very non-controversial. I think he has a great aesthetic. It sounds kind of gay to point it out that way, but it's totally true. You look at a guy and it's like, okay, he's got it. He's got it. Comment down below if you disagree, but I think this sort of look is really fitting to a Wisconsinite that's really sick of the Biden administration and Tammy Baldwin being an accessory to that. And so when you're looking it at that way, of course, I'm stuttering like crazy. You'll notice right off the bat that the guy has a history that's pretty clean, in my opinion, and he has the right aesthetic, like I said. He's running in line with the Trump paradigm, which is fine because he's going to win the state, according to polls. And while Baldwin is winning right now by 5, that is not going to really hold up. You look at the polls at the national level, Trump is winning Wisconsin right now by 1.8. So I don't see how Baldwin is 7 points better than Trump in it, if you know what I mean. So she's 7 points better than Biden is what I meant. That's not really making sense. Again, we have somebody in Patrick, sorry, not basically. You have somebody in Casey in Pennsylvania who has a record of outperforming the incumbent president like Obama, etc., in the Romney election of 2012. So he has bona fides to say that this guy will outperform Biden and maybe beat the Trump margin. Okay. Whereas with Baldwin, she's not been shown to overperform by much. Somebody who does have that record, in fact, is Ron Johnson, who's a conservative Republican who's completely pro-Trump. And so when you look at it that way, Eric Hovde could be that exact remark, okay, where Trump wins the state by 2 and then Hovde can win it by 3. And if he wins it by less, that's still a 2-point cushion. And so when you look at it that way, I think that these polls that show a tie are more accurate than people are giving it credit for. And so I think Baldwin is overrated as a candidate. I don't see her as being an amazing fundraiser. She is not special or remarkable politically at all when it comes to even being far left or a conservative Democrat. She doesn't have anything going in that respect. And if it were Obama 2012, I get it. Okay, he's up by 10 in Wisconsin. But you look at it now and it's like, okay, well, Biden's down in Wisconsin. That's not the coattail you want to be on, okay? If the coattail's already dragging you across the gravel, then you got to get off and build yourself up. But Tammy Baldwin does not have that talent. And I think that's going to lead to a Republican win narrowly in Wisconsin. I'm shooting my shot right there, 54-44, 2 more seats. Let's get right into it. So now that we're getting closer to the money team, we know the House always wins. We know that Sam Brown is leading the primary right now. So again, this is more so just high IQ, knowing trends, knowing how this stuff works. Again, I'm 20 years old, but I've been watching this stuff for years. And what you'll notice is that this sort of polling right at the foot of a primary is going to really affect the person that just won the primary, because there's a somewhat of a disconnected base in the populace in this Republican Party that needs to be sorted out a little bit. And so by June or July, you will get the real head-to-head percentages for the surveys. And so right now, these Senate results are not really indicative of what's going to happen in November. And so when you look at a state percentage, like for instance, Rosen beating Brown by orders of 7% on the aggregate as of 2 months ago, you have to understand that she's only winning 43% of the votes. Now, when you contrast that to the national vote in Nevada, you'll find something really awesome. You're going to find out right off the bat that Joe Biden's popular support in a state he's losing by 4.5% is only 42.8. Well, where's Rosen at? She's at 43. Okay, so they want us to believe that Rosen's going to win with 43% of the vote, but Biden's going to lose by 5 with only 42.8% of the vote. So when you really add this stuff together, what you'll realize is that the vast majority of the people that have Trump winning are going to end up voting for Brown, obviously, as the other Republican on the ballot. I don't know why not, unless they're scared of a guy who looks like Deadpool in real life. But aside from that, then Brown is ought to win. Alrighty, so that's a red Nevada. So my camera, the lighting died, so I'm charging it, but we're gonna keep on going because I'm not that vain. We're gonna keep going to Arizona. I saved the best for last. This is a really important swing state when you really look at it, because beyond everything else, what you'll notice is that it is definitely, I would say it's a little anti-Trump relative to the other states. And so that really is interesting to know, because we have somebody in Kari Lake that's number one, a Trump, basically a carbon copy of his policy when you really just look at it. And so that's really, really interesting to understand, because when you look at it one way, you have Biden up in no regard. Okay, so he's losing it by about 5% to Donald. That being said, of course, we have an election in the Senate that's a lot worse for Kari Lake. Now, what's so troubling with this, of course, is that while Trump is winning by 5, Gay goes up by 6. Now, that's definitely not going to happen in real life. There's no way that there's going to be an 11% disconnect on the margins. But in fact, I do think there can be like a 3% disconnect. And so it depends on how much Trump wins Arizona by. Now, Kari Lake is looking really rough in regards to this election because she is less popular than Donald Trump by any means. And that becomes a real issue because Donald Trump is already at a 50-50 level with Biden in Arizona when you look at it in most situations. And so unless it's a very rosy prediction, it looks like Kari Lake will probably lose. And so it would be a Trump Gallego ticket that's going to be predominant in Arizona, which is crazy. But it seems like, to me, like Kari Lake is on poise to lose. I say this because, for one, it's really difficult to say because on one hand, people will say Biden's going to win on the back of abortion in 2024, but that isn't really true in any state aside from Arizona, where the Supreme Court ridiculously voted on this arcane rule against abortion, which I personally agree with, but at the same time understand that politically it's just asinine because not only is it on track to be repealed by the state representatives, it already has been, but then the Senate is up to vote for it at the state level in Arizona. And so that puts all the Republicans in a really crappy position where now they have to disavow their own virtues in exchange for political expediency, all the while losing some voters thinking that it's all out of political expediency, which it probably is. And so all of a sudden, Carrie Lake's words that she used a couple years ago to endorse that law is now biting her in the ass because she never saw this coming. And so now it's looking like she's on the back foot. And so what she needs to do is that she needs to increase her margin. So again, to win Arizona, you ought to get like 48% of the vote at least. She's at 40 on this aggregate. And in this most favorable poll, which is the most recent one, by the way, it has her down by 2. Now, when you look at it that way, it's still not great. The reason why it's not great is because Lake is looking about as radical, if not worse, than Gallego. The reason why is because when you look at it one way, you see that 2/3 of voters in Arizona are pro-choice to some extent, and Gallego can rep that very easily, whereas Carrie cannot. And when you look at it that way, you could say, oh, well, Lake says that Gallego's far left. Well, how so? Because he wants what, a higher minimum wage? Well, that's popular. Or what? Healthcare? I mean, that's kind of popular. And so you have to look at it that way. But abortion is a killer politically. And so that is the truth. Again, I disagree with it, but that's the way it is. And so Lake has a lot of proving to do before she can say she's winning. First, she needs to paint Gallego as worse than Biden. That's going to be a really hard sell because Biden sucks ass. And when you look at it that way, it's going to be a really steep hill to climb. But I hope she wins, but we'll see what happens. So anyway, I'll see y'all in the next video. Adios.